Welcome to More Than Legal, the show where we go behind the scenes to uncover the fine print of power, purpose, and profit. I'm your host, attorney Danielle Laughlin. After almost 2 decades in the trenches of courtrooms and boardrooms, I have learned that every move leaves a mark and every deal tells a story. What will we uncover today? Let's find out. Hey, real quick, before we dive into the episode, remember, nothing you hear on this podcast is intended to be legal, financial, or tax advice. I invite you to contact any of the guests you hear by looking in the show notes for their contact information, or if you'd like to reach out to me, you can find my contact information at daniellelaughlin.com. All right, now let's get into it. Hey, welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Danielle Laughlin. We're at the More Than Legal podcast, closing out 2025. I'm here with my good friend, Jeremiah Bennett, who has been helping us behind the scenes as we look to make this a better podcast. And so he had an idea to flip the script today and put me in the hot seat to do a little Q&A on the reflections of starting this podcast. So welcome, Jeremiah. I'll let you take it away.
Hey, Danielle, so good to be back again. Yeah, we've had so many great speakers and people we've interviewed over this year, and it's hard to believe that 2025 is about to wrap up. And so, in the season of Thanksgiving, coming into the holidays, is why don't we get back and really reflect on the journey that we've had? So I was like, let's ask Danielle some questions of some of her, favorite moments, take thoughts with these different guests and what she's looking forward to in 2026.
Great.
We first started looking at this podcast. What was the why behind it for you?
There was a long why story that it kind of started with a friend of mine who has a podcast. She's had a lot of success with her podcast, and we were on a hike one day, and I had said to her, I'd love to do a podcast, but I don't want to just make it about me. And so we started exploring, why would we do this? And there were a lot of reasons, but ultimately I came to the conclusion that I feel like I have a gift of communication with people and being able to talk to people very freely. And also I have a lot of knowledge about the inner workings of business and kind of behind the scenes. And I felt like if I could intertwine my ability to help people tell stories with the experiences I had behind the scenes, not the glamorous stuff that we see on social media, but really like what is really going on, we could bring a lot of value to people that are growing companies and help them see that they're not alone in a lot of the ups and downs of their entrepreneurial journey.
All right, let's talk big picture. Looking over the first batch of episodes, who's this podcast for? Entrepreneurs, business owners, your cousin.
Yeah, I think it's for legacy-minded people. They don't necessarily have to be business owners. I think mostly, yes, it's for business owners, but it's for people who are in business that are working toward a common mission and who have a long-term vision for what that business should be. And they are really trying to build something sustainable. And whether they are intrapreneurs in that business or they are the actual entrepreneurs.
So when you look for guests and topics, are you looking for, let's say, purpose, profitability, culture, lending? I think you mentioned legacy. So yeah, what really sticks out when you're like, okay, that's the guest or that's the topic that I need to do?
I am most attracted to people that are doing business on purpose. So they are driven by something more than profit motive, but they are not shy about their profit motive. So they're looking for a greater purpose. From bankers to even producers like you and others we've had on the show, every person is driving a mission and a purpose. And I think that goes to the culture that they're trying to build, whether it's small or large, and then also just ultimately the legacy, right? The legacy is the driver.
So let's go back. So on your first episode, you were your own guest and host, and you laid the groundwork about doing business with purpose is more than legal. How, you know, you say the definition of purpose, has it shifted or sharpened at all from that very first episode? Because again, like I said, the title was doing business with purpose is more than legal.
Yeah. I think it has become sharper. Purpose, when I first started, I thought, okay, we can bring value. That was kind of my driving purpose. As I talked to the other, guests, I realized that purpose is really less about what we intentionally are trying to achieve and more about the natural progression of how I believe God drives our lives, right? So we have a general vision. Most visionaries have a general vision of where they're trying to go. And that purpose really actually shows itself through the process and often through the reflective hindsight, vision where you actually have clarity around how those dots connected. I think it was Steve Jobs who said that you could kind of look back and see these breadcrumbs and then you can see how the dots connect. I think now I appreciate that more than I did when I first started this podcast, because I now see how all these little breadcrumbs did the same for me and kind of got me to where I am. And that's what each of the guests have sort of shared as well. Similar.
On episode 2, you were also your own host and guest.
I was really full of myself back then.
Well, I'm not saying that. We're going to leave that because we know what libel is, and we're not getting into that today.
Don't libel yourself.
But the title was legal, Legal, like spelled out as you broke it down. So, and that was part of your secret sauce. So, what framework did you come up with the most real client situations this year that you can talk about?
Yeah. I'll be honest. I don't always bring it out to the clients, when you have business matters going on, whether they're positive or negative, it's weird to be like, why don't I pull out my trusty acronym and make sure we're following all the steps?
Right.
So it's not always very obvious that this is what is happening. But the way that it shows up the most with client work is when they have a big decision that they need to make, and there are a lot of competing either liabilities or risks, and they're almost in analysis paralysis. So we kind of start with that rule, that law, right? And then we have to go to what is their ethic, what is their ethical position about where they see themselves from a stakeholder versus stockholder position. And I don't use those words with them. That doesn't really meet them where they are, but it's more about helping to understand, are they primarily driven by money? Is this a money decision, a business decision? Mm-hmm. Or is this more about a principle or something that is less tangible to them? And then once I can understand where their motivator's coming from, we can kind of work through the rest of those problems much easier. And so it's kind of like sticking in on, is it about the money? If it's about the money, math is math. And we can, that's an easier calculation than reputation or, potential future opportunity. So it's really in those difficult decisions when it's not easy to see what the best answer is.
And that was a perfect segue to episode 3, where you talked to Greg Cabtree about it was called Profitability and Making the Math Not Suck.
Yeah. I love Greg.
And so what's one thing from that conversation that you wish every business owner actually would implement in the new year?
The biggest takeaway I had from that conversation was return on invested capital. Treating every dollar that you're investing as an actual investment. So sometimes you put $1 in and you want to see $3 to $10 out. But are you actually tracking that? A lot of times it's like not being very well tracked, and how he really talked about, viewing every dollar that you invest as that, really looking at whether it's giving you the return that you need it to. And then sometimes that return takes some time also. And so he, as an accountant, the best thing that I really took from Greg was, don't listen to the accountants. or find the right kind of accountant, I guess, maybe, is really. And I'm proud to say I'm onboarding as a new client of their firm. So I'm getting the right accountant.
Awesome. So we're going to skip a few episodes and we're going to jump over to episode 10, where it was Planning Beyond Profit, where you and Ray talked about securing the future, not just chasing revenue. So how has that episode influenced the way you want to talk to Sage clients about long-term planning?
Oh, yeah. Ray pointed out a lot of things that I think clients and listeners too can take from his experience, which is, there are short-term plans that you need to make, but you should not make them at the expense of the long-term plan. And I think that Ray's perspective is, yes, there are strategies that we should implement. A lot of those strategies are going to be driven by politics and different laws or regulations that may or may not be in effect at the time certain events are happening in our lives. And so having the agility, I think, was a big takeaway in talking to Ray, just having agility in how you're making plans and not sacrificing the long term for what looks to be the most expedient today.
So we're going to back up a little bit, where you were your own guest again. And you talked about in episode 4, culture is the new capital. So you did this whole episode this year. How did you see culture really show up as a real asset or a liability in the businesses around you? Again, not naming names. We can't do that.
Right. Absolutely. So, I think culture can be, it could be a deal killer, or it could really improve, a company's valuation, objectively speaking. And really where I've seen this show up the most, that, just this year, is clients actually looking at their company as a brand, and like building brand equity and realizing that the culture has to fit the image of the brand. And if you have a brand that's all about helping people and making people's lives better, and then your culture is all about the bottom line and, driving profit, those two things don't align. And those are risky, because you can end up having a very public downfall, and we've seen that with some of the larger companies that have kind of gone through some litigation around this stuff. But even with small companies, what people expect to get from you and what your team thinks it is that they're supposed to be doing has to align. And
Most definitely.
yeah. And when it does, that's when you have real power. You have brand equity and you have culture that is driving towards a common message that is actually what's being delivered.
Talking about something else that needs to align, on episode 7, you talked about from the football fields to financial freedom. So football teams have to align, or, we can't have people running the ball multiple directions, right? So you sat down with Will on that, and you talked about what leadership and legacy and what his story really stuck with you in terms of how owners should be thinking about their teams and their wealth.
Yeah, I love football, college football, at least. And I thought Will's experience as a coach, a high school coach, then turning into wealth management was very interesting, because yes, again, it kind of goes back to what we just talked about. The most successful football teams have success because their culture is aligned. They're not on the field thinking. There's no cognitive dissonance between getting on the field and winning that game versus walking back to the locker room and still being willing to go fight another day, even if you don't. And that winning is a mindset. And I think that in business, you have to have winners, people that want to win on your team. And when you have that, you can do a lot of great things. And I think Will, knows that. And so he has a team approach to how he does advisory, which I think is the best case scenario for clients. When we can talk with their wealth managers and we can talk with their CPAs and other business, advisors and be part of a team, then we can do more good for the client and ultimately be the tide that's lifting all the boats. Roll Tide.
Touche. So now we're going to go from sports over to art, right? So in episode 8, you had a great conversation with Molly talking about the art of business and the business of art and how you bridge creativity and entrepreneurship. For owners that see themselves as not creative, what do you wish that conversation could teach you and what they could hear?
I think for entrepreneurs that don't consider themselves creative, which I see more often with I see it more often with, I think, men usually in this context, because men are very data driven. And so kind of like, I do see it a lot more with men. I don't know if that's just my personal experience, but as I answer that, that's the person I'm thinking of. And creativity is inherent in entrepreneurship, because when the problems arise, you have to be able to solve the problems. And so problem solving, while it's logical, it's also, you have to have an aspect of creativity, because if you're just going to be rinsing and repeating the status quo, you can't innovate. And if you're not innovating as an entrepreneur, your business is likely to die, right? Like it's not going to evolve. And so if anybody's struggling with thinking of themselves as a creative in business, I think that's where they would start, is just taking a look at, when was the last time you had a big problem on your hands and you came up with a really out of the box solution? That is creativity. You don't need to be a painter, or some kind of like, filmographer or whatever. Like you can be creative in your very boring HVAC business, for example, right? Like that.
Right. Everyone has problems, bringing solutions to them and using creativity and expressing that.
Absolutely.
So jumping from that, let's go into media and the news. You and Donna had a great conversation about a lot of things and how you really dug into like how stories are shaped and just the real world views that we maybe don't see, and even how media is curated. How has that changed the way you think about stories business owners should tell themselves about risk, law, and money?
All of those are a story, right? So risk is a story, and usually your risk tolerance is an indicator about whether you view risk as a horror story or as a feel-good romantic drama. And I think, most entrepreneurs are going to view risk as more of a romantic, drama than a horror story. I think with law, it's the same thing. There's a story that can be told, and if you're afraid of that story, you're going to make decisions out of fear rather than being empowered. And then with money, of course, your mindset around money is going to indicate how you view both risk and law, right? Because if you feel that money is finite and that you have to reserve it and hold it and protect it and secure it, you are going to see a lot of things that are not high risk as higher risk than they really are. You will not make decisions out of a place of abundance. You will make a decision out of a place of fear. And then ultimately, when you make fear-based decisions, you actually end up creating more risk for yourself in the long run. And so I think Donna's, experience and her perspective being, in the media for so long is how, whatever the spin is, whether it's the spin from the media conglomerate or the spin from your own subconscious mind, you have to be able to assess the truth of that story. So I think that was a big takeaway in talking to Donna. She gave that really interesting example that I didn't know anything about with a balloon. It was like a dad who said he had blown up this balloon, his kid inside of this big balloon.
Mm-hmm.
And like all the media outlets were following the story, but it was a big hoax. And she said that she decided not to do that. And it was like, that's like, you have to have that discernment to know even when other people are chasing these stories, whether they're real or not.
So some of the other topics that we kind of went into this past year were about legacy, exit, and what outlives you. So in episode 11, you spoke with Rayo about building a legacy that's different than just building a business. What one question from that conversation that you find yourself now asking your own clients?
I think what Rayo taught me is, a lot of our clients are chasing an exit. They want to sell. They want to sell for multiples, 7 to 10x. And they're just waiting for that opportunity. And she, as somebody who had been through it without planning to go through it, right? Like it sort of just happened for her. She had a very unique perspective that I try to help clients with, which is there's something that's going to come next. She's taking a sabbatical and then it's like, and then. So everybody thinks that they're going to be happy. If they could just get to the margaritas by the beach sooner, then they would be so happy to experience this great wealth where they could just do whatever it is that they wanted to do. But high performers will never be happy sitting by the beach. And so there's always going to be something next. And if you can't anticipate a better something next for yourself than what you have right now, just stick with what you know and keep it going and stop chasing down the headline that may not be as glamorous as you thought it was going to be once you get there.
In episode 12, you talked to Tricia about From Law to Legacy. You explored legacy, impact, creativity. How did that episode stretch your own idea of legacy and what can look like for a founder?
I really appreciated Tisha coming from an industry like law, which is a very rigid industry. And because I've been through it myself and I live it, I know that. And so the experience of law school is very jarring and difficult for a lot of people. It is what I consider to be a mental boot camp where they kind of they break you all the way down so they can build you up into the thinking machine that they need you to be. And they do that to drive you into big law, to work for large corporations, insurance companies, banks, et cetera. And when you come out like she did and I did, and you're working for these institutional clients, you begin to realize that everything that you wanted to achieve when you started this journey, it looks nothing like what you have before you. And so what I think she did a great job at explaining is the story that she told, all goes back to story. The story she told herself was that she hated law, that it was not who she was, that who she was this interior designer, creative, butterfly type. And in fact, now that she's on the other side of that, she's found a way to merge her creative passion with her profession. And legacy is a blending of money and purpose and passion. And so you as a founder, or even just a person with a family, you have to consider yourself as an integrated whole. And I thought Tisha was a really great example of an integrated whole who had experienced the extremes of what she felt were kind of these two tugging forces in her life.
Awesome. Threading all of these episodes together: purpose, profitability, culture, lending, legacy. Where can you see your views, ethics on free market capitalism showing up the clearest?
I knew we were going to get to my free market capitalism at some point, and we're there. So I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about free market capitalism that I've seen up close and personal for 2 decades. And we've now reached a place where these questions are becoming more and more public, and they're being discussed directly in policy conversations now, which I welcome. I think we should be talking about this. How do those ideas show up in free market capitalism? Ultimately, we are here to flourish. Humanity is constantly seeking more. There's an insatiable need to just keep doing bigger, better, bigger, better. We all have that need.
Right.
And capitalism aligns to that need in the best way, right? In my view. And so what capitalism makes possible is a dream, a vision, the pooling of creative minds, human capital together to pursue that idea. And then a value creation on the back end, which is more value for more people. And so in a free market system, humans are free to create more value. And when they're free to create more value, I believe more often than not, they're doing that for a purpose that is more than just about themselves, but it's actually about them wanting to improve humanity. And when you hear the great entrepreneurs out there, right? The one that comes to mind at this moment that I am very inspired by is Sarah Blakely with the Spanx brand. And when you hear Sarah talk about the beginning of her journey, the tenacity that she had to create essentially women's, underwear, but she was driven by a big problem that women were experiencing and was making it difficult for women to enjoy their wardrobes and how they were feeling and looking in certain clothing, which she knows as a woman, as the consumer that she was creating her product for, really seems a little silly, maybe, to men. I don't know. But for women, is actually a really big problem for us. And so she wasn't driven to be this super rich lady, which she is, rightfully so, but she was driven to help and solve a problem. And then what she's done since then is try to lift other women up. And she's just very, has a big need to give back. So I think that what the hook, line, and sinker of what we hear about capitalism in the media is that it's all greedy and all these wealthy, ultra wealthy people that are taking all of the capital and they're going to control us all. And that's just not the truth.
Right.
GDP is driven by small business. It's not driven by these mega corps. And so they keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger. But so does our overall GDP, meaning that the rest of the wealth of the United States is also growing as those big companies grow too. And we're not telling that story. We're not talking about that. And I think it's important that we talk about it. And it's one of the reasons that I love having the show, to be able to show people that there are really good people out there trying to do great things in the world, not because they want to be rich, but yeah, they should be rich for what they're doing. I don't apologize for that, but that's not why they're doing it. And I think that it's important that we talk about that.
So was there a moment this year, either in an episode or with a Sage client, where you thought, this is exactly what healthy capitalism looks like?
Yeah, I mean, I think almost all of them, every single person was driving their own destiny, whether they were doing it as support to entrepreneurs, the bankers, the financial professionals, or whether they were doing it as entrepreneurs. It really was, I think, a constant revelation of what healthy capitalism looks like. Not everybody has to be at the helm of the next great business, but it takes a village to build that brand. And that is what I think is healthy, is having a village and wanting a village also, and not trying to be a lone wolf. So I feel like everybody that I talked to really did embody that.
So for the business owner that has listened to a few episodes of this great pod this year, but they're in the weeds, what's one takeaway that you would say to go into next year with? And just one.
One. A dream without a plan is just a hallucination. Somebody said that, not me. I didn't make that up. But you need a plan. You have to have a plan. And if you're in the weeds on a hamster wheel, just getting it out is a good first step. Just writing down all of your hopes, dreams, and fears, and then organizing it into a plan. And then, of course, executing against the plan.
Awesome. Also looking into, 2026 and beyond, how do you want people to use this podcast? What's the best way for an owner to plug this into their growth and not just passively listen?
I think, it's hard sometimes because we're all moving super fast and there's a lot that we have to be responsible for. But if you take this pod and there is an episode where that guest or something I'm saying is resonating with you, just copy the transcript. Feed that thing to your AI. I don't care. This is going to be published, have it help you organize some thoughts and some key takeaways. If you're using AI, as I believe you should responsibly, to help you with your internal thinking, then it can be a really good tool to kind of take the ideas you hear and then apply them directly to your situation. And then, of course, if there's something you need help with, because it's financial, tax, or legal, get help, get some help with that. But you can always just start with what can I DIY? And, AI tools can be a good place to start.
When you look at your guest, your team, your listeners, what are you most grateful for in this first stretch of More Than Legal?
Man, my team has changed since we launched the podcast a little bit. We kind of switched some things up a little bit. But really, I threw a lot at them because I'm kind of this shiny object person. I'm working on that. But we did this all internally. And, there are definitely some lessons we learned about what was not working. But I think overall, I am so grateful that I have winners on the team. They want to win and they'll figure out how to win. And they're just very tenacious about that. So I want to say thank you, Marcial. Thank you, Valerie, who's not here anymore. Thank you for everything that you did to help us get here. And then Brittany's behind the scenes, making sure that things are getting paid and all that. And nobody really ever sees her either, but she also was helping. And then, of course, bringing you on. I'm grateful that we met, a couple of years back and connected, and that you saw something in me that you thought was worth it, and I saw the same in you, and so this is also something I'm really grateful for.
Well, thank you. So the last question, which is a direct message to the person that has been listening quietly all year but hasn't raised their hand, what do you want to say to them right now?
Thank you. Thank you very much for listening. I don't know where this goes or like how far it gets out there, but if even one person can take one piece of anything that's been said on this show and take action and make their lives better, I feel like it was totally worth the bloopers and the hours it takes to make something like this happen.
Well, Danielle, thank you for allowing me to flip the script on you, put you a little bit in the hot seat, reflect on some great moments, some wonderful guests, the amazing team that you and I have both been able to work with on this pod. And here's to looking to 2026 and greater things yet to come.
Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you for listening to the show. Remember, stay sharp, stay curious, and stay tuned for our next episode. Bye for now.